Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, March 24th, 2022. President Joe Biden announcing new sanctions against Russian companies and legislators, stressing NATO unity in responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and promising a response if Russia uses chemical weapons. All after a series of emergency summits with world leaders at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. The war now 1 month old. President Biden also promising the U.S. will welcome 100,000 Ukrainian refugees and agrees that Russia should be kicked out of the G20, the group of nations with the top 20 economies. We'll have highlights from his news conference in just a moment. In Washington, D.C., final day for the Supreme Court confirmation hearing for nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Legal experts and interest group witnesses testifying, some of them disagreeing about the judge's record on sentencing criminals. But the American Bar Association telling the Senate Judiciary Committee that Judge Jackson has earned its highest rating, well qualified. And after the hearing, the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell going to the Senate floor and announcing he'll be voting no on the nomination. And the Biden administration seeking reforms to end home appraisal bias, where appraisers, consciously or unconsciously, value a home owned by a racial or ethnic minority less than a home owned by someone who is white. Associated Press from Brussels, Belgium, where NATO is headquartered, writes that President Joe Biden and Western allies pledged new sanctions and humanitarian aid on Thursday in response to Vladimir Putin's assault on Ukraine. But the offers fell short of a more robust military assistance that President Volodymyr Zelenskyy pleaded for in a pair of live video appearances. The leaders spent Thursday crafting their next steps to counter Russia's month-old invasion and huddling over how they might respond should Putin deploy chemical, biological, or even a nuclear weapon. They met in a trio of emergency summits that had them shuttling across Brussels for back-to-back-to-back meetings of NATO, the Group of 7 industrialized nations, and the 27-member European Council. That was all from AP. President Biden, in the middle of all this, holding a news conference and detailing new steps in terms of sanctions and humanitarian aid.
The United States is committed to provide over $2 billion in military equipment to Ukraine since I became president. Anti-air systems, anti-armor systems, ammunition, and our weapons are flowing into Ukraine as I speak. And today, I'm announcing the United States is prepared to commit more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians affected by the war in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes. But we also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families. And we will invest $320 million to bolster democratic resilience and defend human rights in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We're also coordinating with the G7 and the European Union on food security as well as energy security. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. We're also announcing new sanctions of more than 400 individuals and entities in alignment with the European Union. More than 300 members of the Duma, oligarchs, and Russian defense companies that fuel the Russian war machine. In addition to the 100,000 U.S. forces now stationed in Europe to defend NATO territory, NATO established, as you already know, 4 new battle groups in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia to reinforce the Eastern Front. Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January, it was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine.
President Joe Biden, part of his opening statement at a news conference in Brussels at NATO headquarters. The White House and NATO have been warning for weeks that Russia could be preparing to use chemical or biological weapons in the war in Ukraine, or to create a false flag operation using them, saying falsely, that it was actually the Ukrainian forces that had used the weapons. President Biden asked about that today, and also the continuing reluctance to get more directly involved in the war militarily. Ukrainian leadership has been asking for a NATO-enforced no-fly zone to keep Russian planes and out and for NATO countries to send them or sell them fighter planes, tanks, and other weapons. Here's the question to the president.
Cecilia, ABC. There you are.
Oh, thank you. Sir, you've made it very clear in this conflict that you do not want to see World War III. But is it possible that in expressing that so early that you were too quick to rule out direct military intervention in this war? Could Putin have been emboldened knowing that you are not going to get involved directly in this conflict?
No and no.
And to clarify on chemical weapons, if chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, would that trigger a military response from NATO?
It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
President Biden at his news conference in Brussels also asked if he believes Russia should be removed from the Group of 20 or G20, the organization of the top 20 economic powers in the world, and if Ukraine needs to give up territory in order to achieve a ceasefire.
Mr. President, in your view, does President Zelenskyy need to cede any Ukrainian territory in order to gain a ceasefire with Russia, or is that completely off the table? And then also, do you think that Russia needs to be removed from the G20?
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe. With regard to, what was the first question?
If you think that Ukraine needs to cease, to give up any territory in order to get a ceasefire.
That is a total judgment based on Ukraine. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. I don't believe that they're going to have to do that, but that's a judgment. There's negotiations, that are discussions, I should say, that have taken place that I have not been part of, including the Ukrainians, and it's their judgment to make.
President Joe Biden with reporters in Brussels. He next heads to Poland, a NATO ally which borders Ukraine, to meet with the Polish president and visit Ukrainian war refugees. A perspective about the war and the U.S.-NATO response from the U.S. House Republicans. They're holding an issue policy retreat in Florida. Holding a news conference today, Congressman Michael McConnell, Republican of Texas, ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Congressman Michael Turner, Republican from Ohio, ranking member on the Intelligence Committee. They are on a task force putting together policy positions that's actually about China, but during the news conference, getting questions from reporters on Russia and Ukraine.
Ranking Member McCall, what is Biden not doing that he should be doing currently in Ukraine? And you mentioned red lines. What would be a red line for you in terms of sending Americans into Ukraine to fight the Russians?
I don't think anybody wants American soldiers in Ukraine. The no-fly zone would put us at immediate war with Russia because NATO planes will obviously be in conflict with the Russian aircraft. I wish he would stop talking about what he wouldn't do. I will not do this. I will not do that. He should keep all options on the table. Condoleezza Rice told us that today as well. That's a bad diplomacy posture. It's also a very bad message to say a minor incursion's okay, like going into the Donbass. I mean, that sent, that laid the predicate for aggression. But I do think the red line's important. And how are we going to respond if this happens? I keep saying he's like the scorpion. If he's backed in a corner, he's going to come out stinging. And the best, he's got chemical, but these short-range tactical nukes are the ones that I don't see how the world can sit back and watch the bully pick on the little kid on the playground, or like Davy and Goliath, and do nothing in response to that. The question is, what is the response? And that's something we are talking about at very high levels in the administration, both Mike and myself, about what would be the appropriate red line consequence. But it can't be like Obama setting a red line in Syria and chemical weapons were laid down, and then there was no, consequence. If you have any thoughts.
In the past 10 years, there has been a NATO country that has shot down a Russian plane. It was Turkey. Turkey gave them a warning. They gave them a red line. Do not continue to enter into our airspace. They did again. Turkey took down a Russian military craft. It did not result in an exchange with NATO. It did not result in nuclear war or World War III. What there was a clear red line. An action was taken, and there was action that occurred. I think having clarity of what Russia should not do as a red line is incredibly important, or we're going to constantly be facing, as we have with this administration, the reaction or the trying to catch up. As was asked earlier, Congress is leaning in, but Russia is continuing on, and this administration continues to be in a reacting mode rather than making it clear that there are red lines, there are norms upon which that this administration believes that it would absolutely result in a response by the United States and NATO, whatever that response may be. That just an understanding that there are those red lines, I think, can help deter and contain Russia.
And, I also think, what is provocative, right? This administration's been one hand tied behind their back. Oh, it's provocative to put MiGs in, provocative to do a red line. Putin is the provocative one here. Why not draw a red line and say, if you cross this line, you're the one, that's being provocative. And I don't see how the world can sit by and watch chemical or nuclear weapons being used in direct violation of the Geneva Convention, which makes him a war criminal. And, the USG, as Blinken said, has already determined there's enough evidence killing civilians in maternity hospitals that he is. But if he throws chemical and nuclear in, to me, that makes the case even stronger. And then I think in Congress we'll be looking at a resolution, on basically war crimes.
Congressman Michael McConnell is the ranking Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee from Texas, joined by Congressman Michael Turner, ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee from Ohio, at the House Republican Issues Policy Retreat in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida today. They referred to Condoleezza Rice, that's the former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under President George W. Bush, speaking to this group. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy speaking in a video address at today's emergency meeting of leaders of the 30 NATO countries in Brussels, Belgium. President Zelenskyy again pleading for more weapons. In this clip, you'll hear specifically for tanks, and accusing Russia of using phosphorus munitions, killing both adults and children.
You have at least 20,000 tanks. Ukraine was asking 500. From all of your tanks, just 500. Give them to us. Sell them to us. So far, we haven't got a clear answer. That is the most terrible time in the war. There are no clear answers. We ask the West for help. Ukraine never wanted this war. Ukraine doesn't want to wage war for years and years. We simply want to survive, to save our people. Any people have the right to life, right to this single percent. I do not want to blame NATO. I understand this is not you. This is not your missiles or bombs which are destroying our cities. Today, from the morning, we had bombs, Russian phosphorus bombs. Again, children were dying, people were dying. I simply want you to know the alliance still can prevent Ukrainian deaths from Russian strikes, from Russian occupation, by providing us all the munitions we're asking for. Yes, we're not part of the alliance. I'm not putting any blame here. Well, the alliance and the state of the alliance, that's different. It's a question of life and death.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, through an interpreter, a video address to the NATO leaders meeting in Brussels, Belgium. About that charge that Russia deployed phosphorus bombs, NBC News has a story that reads, "White phosphorus munitions operate in the same way as incendiary weapons by setting fires and causing burns, with the capability to cause fire to spread over a wide area, according to Human Rights Watch. They aren't banned under international law, but their usage is restricted in populated areas." The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg holding a news conference after today's emergency meeting of the heads of state and government of the 30 NATO countries. Stoltenberg asked about the possible Russian use of weapons that are prohibited under the laws of war.
Financial Times.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Congratulations on your annual extension. You said in the statement that allies agreed to enhance preparedness and readiness for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. Is that based on credible intelligence that those threats could be imminent? And how does the alliance strengthen its protection against those threats? Thank you.
So we are concerned, partly because we see the rhetoric and we see that Russia is trying to create some kind of pretext accusing Ukraine, United States, NATO allies for preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And we have seen before that this way of accusing others is actually a way to create a pretext for do the same themselves. And of course, the accusations against Ukraine and NATO allies are absolutely false. Any use of chemical weapons will totally change the nature of the conflict. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have widespread consequences and, of course, be extremely dangerous. It will affect the people in Ukraine, but there's also a risk that will have a direct effect on people living in NATO countries, because we can see contamination, we can see the spread of chemical agents or biological weapons into our countries. We also know that Russia has used chemical agents against its own opposition, and they have used it on NATO territory in Salisbury before. And we also know that Russia has facilitated, supported the Assad regime in Syria when they used chemical weapons against their own population. So this just highlights the importance of ending this war immediately, because this is a dangerous situation. And therefore we impose the sanctions, therefore we support Ukraine. Allies agreed to supply equipment to help Ukraine protect against chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear threats. This could include detection equipment, protection and medical support, as well as training for decontamination and crisis management. We are also enhancing allies' preparedness and readiness for chemical and biological and nuclear threats. Our top military commander, General Walters, has activated NATO's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense elements, and allies are deploying additional chemical and biological and nuclear defenses to reinforce our existing and new battle groups. So we are taking measures both to support Ukraine and also to defend ourselves.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, news conference at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. The questioner, the reporter, asked him about and complimented him on the extension of his term. NATO did extend Stoltenberg's term by a year today. It was supposed to expire this September. Instead, he'll be staying on until September 30th, 2023. NATO says it's to provide stability to the military alliance due to the threat of a wider war in Europe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But this from CNN. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said he thinks it's unlikely there will be a full-fledged war between Russia and the alliance. Stoltenberg, speaking to CNN's Christiane Amanpour, credited the NATO countries' display of unity for lowering the likelihood of a full-scale war. Washington Post had a story overnight. Repeated attempts by the United States top defense and military leaders to speak with their Russian counterparts have been rejected by Moscow for the last month, leaving the world's two largest nuclear powers in the dark about explanations for military movements and raising fears of a major miscalculation or battlefield accident. The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby asked about this on Fox News Channel today.
There was a report this morning I wanted to ask you about that the Pentagon had been trying to reach out to Russia's military, and those calls had not been either picked up or they're not communicating with the Pentagon. What's the purpose of that outreach, and why do you think the snub?
NATO headquarters, she's inside.
We think that communication with the Russians is important, particularly now. In fact, now more than ever, to be able to communicate with our Russian counterparts and make sure that we can convey our continued concerns about the manner in which they're prosecuting this unprovoked war. We have tried on numerous occasions to connect Secretary Austin with his counterpart. Chairman Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has also tried to connect with his counterpart. We've made multiple attempts here, but they have not answered up. They've declined to take these calls. Now, I will say that it's not like we don't have any communication with the Russians. We can do that through our embassy. We have a defense attaché in Moscow. We have a deconfliction line, of course, that we're using. It's really not so much for normal comms, but in order to be able to deconflict, particularly in that airspace as you get closer to NATO's eastern flank. So there are vehicles. We still have military-to-military communications with the Russians, but at the senior levels, where we think it's really important, particularly right now, it's not happening, and it's not happening because the Russians don't seem to be interested.
Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby on Fox News Channel. More from the Washington Post story. Communications between the United States and Russia have been much more sparse since the war began last month. U.S. Ambassador to Russia, John J. Sullivan, has met with Russian officials most frequently with on and off visits and calls in Moscow. President Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke to his counterpart last week for the first time since the start of the conflict, and some U.S. and Russian military officials met last week at the Russian Ministry of Defense. This is Washington Today. White House condemning North Korea's latest long-range ballistic missile test, calling it a brazen violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. Reports say that the missile was fired at a high angle, reaching an altitude of almost 4,000 miles and splashed into the ocean downrange about 700 miles, indicating that if it were fired at a lower angle, as North Korea claims, it could reach North America and carry a nuclear warhead. The Senate Armed Services Committee on Capitol Hill in Washington heard today from NORAD Commander General Glenn Van Herk, and he was asked by the committee chair, Senator Jack Reed, Democrat from Rhode Island, whether the U.S. is prepared to shoot down such a missile.
The North Korean missile activity is quite disturbing. Indeed, hours ago, they launched a missile which, from analysis of the flight path, suggests could hit the United States. Given this behavior, what are your thoughts about the current 44 ground-based interceptors and their current capability?
Chairman, I'm comfortable with where we are today based on the intelligence I have with the current capabilities and capacity of North Korea. Going forward, I do believe that they could exceed my capacity and capabilities. That's why it's crucial to keep Next Generation Interceptor on time or early. In my discussions with Admiral Hill, he's confident right now that they're on that path. As far as the total number of 44 interceptors, that's a policy decision. I look forward to seeing the Missile Defense Review and the policy that it provides and guidance to me to get after the capacity and challenges that you allude to, sir.
So you are, at this point, confident that the Next Generation Interceptor is on track for deployment. I think the plan is 20 interceptors at Fort Greely by FY 2028. Is that still holding?
That is correct, and I'm confident that it is on track for that now or slightly early, based on what I've seen.
Very good.
General Glenn Van Herk, commander of Northern Command and also North America Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Question from Chairman Senator Jack Reed. U.S. does have 44 ground-based interceptors in Alaska and California, with those plans to add 20 more by near the end of this decade. Washington Today continues in a minute.
There's been much more recognition of the historic contributions of America's First Ladies in recent years. So join us as C-SPAN takes you through the White House experiences of 8 modern First Ladies, from Lady Bird Johnson to Melania Trump. using material from C-SPAN's award-winning biography series, First Ladies, and source material from the C-SPAN video library, you'll hear these first spouses talk about the issues important to them while in the White House. First Ladies in their own words. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts.
Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio is a wrap-up of the day's events from the nation's capital, Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern. Hear the latest from the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, including congressional hearings, news conferences, and politics. Washington Today also features journalist interviews on the issues of the day. Washington Today, Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern. Available on C-SPAN Radio and also as a podcast. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow so you never miss an episode.
And welcome back to Washington Today, available as that podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you listen to podcasts. Fourth and final day of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing for Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. The witnesses today, legal experts and interest group representatives. As is now customary, the first panel came from the American Bar Association, which is asked to evaluate the nominee. The chair of the ABA's Standing Committee on the Judiciary, Ann Claire Williams, testifying that Judge Jackson has earned the ABA's highest ranking, well qualified.
We don't give suggestions on who should be nominated, don't recommend or endorse any nominee. We don't base our ratings on or express any view of the nominee's philosophy, political affiliation, or ideology. Nonpartisan peer review evaluations are the hallmark of the Standing Committee. We began our work on February 25th, the day Judge Jackson was nominated. On March 18th, the Standing Committee voted unanimously that Judge Jackson earned our highest rating, well qualified for an appointment to the Supreme Court. Why? Quite frankly, well qualified was a rating we were compelled to reach after our exhaustive, comprehensive peer review. To get that well qualified rating, a Supreme Court nominee must be a preeminent member of the legal profession, have outstanding legal ability, have exceptional breadth of experience, and meet the very highest standards of integrity, professional competence, and judicial temperament. Everyone we talked to, interviewed, or had substantive contact with uniformly gave the highest praise: brilliant, beyond reproach, first rate, patient, insightful, impeccable, A+.
Ann Claire Williams chairs the American Bar Association committee that makes recommendations on whether federal judges are qualified for the position to which they've been nominated, testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee today on the fourth and final day of the hearing for Supreme Court nominee Judge Jackson. The second panel of witnesses included the head of a civil rights organization, an anti-abortion activist, a law professor, and a friend of Judge Jackson. Also, Alabama's Attorney General and the president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and those latter two focusing on an issue that's been raised this past week with the judge as senators were asking her questions: sentencing in criminal cases, especially crimes involving child pornography, during the judge's 9 years on the federal bench. Here's the testimony of Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall, a Republican.
Criminal justice advocacy groups have repeatedly highlighted Judge Jackson as a jurist focused on serving the most vulnerable and giving a voice to the voiceless, referring also to the socioeconomic and racial status of the offender population as evidence of a biased and broken system, while overlooking the inconvenient reality that the race and socioeconomic status of a crime victim is often identical to his or her offenders. A 2018 report by the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that the offender was of the same race or ethnicity as the victim in 70% of violent offenses involving black victims and 62% of violent offenses involving white victims. That same report showed that the largest percentage of violent crime victims were from households with annual incomes of less than $25,000 annually. Another study on crime victims found that the overall risk of violent victimization is highest among persons who are younger, male, black, living in the poorest households, and living in urban areas. These voices matter too. In Judge Jackson's now infamous law review article, gives me no assurance that she would give voice to the voiceless victims of sex crimes. In that note, she questioned the necessity of sex offender community notification requirements, a common sense public safety measure that this body passed with bipartisan support and that the public overwhelmingly approves. Remarkably, the word victim did not appear once in her analysis. Promoting the false creed that the American criminal justice system is unfair, a reference Judge Jackson herself used in the opening line of a 2020 opinion, undermines justice itself. It denigrates the rule of law. It impedes the ability of law enforcement to protect and serve. It impairs the duty of prosecutors to keep violent criminals behind bars. All of this subverts the safety of the public and is most detrimental to the very voices Judge Jackson claims to speak for. I've heard nothing this week to alleviate my fear that Judge Jackson believes that a fundamental redesign is needed in our criminal justice system and that she would be so inclined to use her position on the court to this end. For this reason, I respectfully oppose her nomination.
Alabama's Attorney General Steve Marshall testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee today. Another witness on that same panel, Frederick Thomas. He is with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, its national president, and endorsing Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson for the Supreme Court. Thomas is also a captain in the East Baton Rouge, Louisiana Sheriff's Office.
Noble joins the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Fraternal Order of Police, the more than 60 top law enforcement leaders and former Republicans and Democratic attorney generals endorsing Judge Jackson. She has a unique perspective on the needs of law enforcement through the association of her family members in the profession. Judge Jackson has two uncles who were career law enforcement officers. One was the detective for the Miami-Dade County, and the other rose to the rank of become chief of police for Miami Police Department. In addition, her brother served as an undercover officer in a drug sting unit in Baltimore after graduating from college. It is our opinion that the direct familiarization with the complexity, challenges, and opportunity within law enforcement provides perspective on criminal justice issues that can be assessed to the Supreme Court. In evaluating her judicial track record, it is the opinion of NOBA and other law enforcement organizations that Judge Brown has constantly adjudicated based on the facts and applied the law fairly. Ketanji Brown Jackson had been previously vetted twice by the Judiciary Committee and twice confirmed by the full Senate as a judge, garnering bipartisan support as recently as 2021. She was also confirmed in 2010 as the vice chair of the U.S. Sentencing Commission. It is noble hope that Ketanji Brown Jackson will receive the bipartisan support for the most prestigious nomination to the nation's highest court.
Sheriff Frederick Thomas, president of NOBLE, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, one of the witnesses at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing today for the nomination of Supreme Court nominee Judge Jackson. If she is confirmed, she'll become the first African-American woman to be on the Supreme Court in U.S. history, and that history-making event was the focus of another witness at today's confirmation hearing, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, Democrat from Ohio. She chairs the Congressional Black Caucus.
Judge Jackson's confirmation will send a message to Black women and little girls like my granddaughter Leah, whose mother is the first Black woman to serve on the 10th District Court of Appeals. And Leah's first known president was a Black man, and now she sees a Black female vice president. So if a guidance counselor tells her, your goals are too high, she will remember how Judge Jackson soared against adversity as one of our nation's brightest legal minds. I want to be crystal clear. Judge Jackson will be a judge that will serve all of America, and all of America can be proud of. Watching Judge Jackson sit at this very table, displaying poise, grace, courage, and brilliance, no matter what was thrown at her, reminds me of the sheroes whose shoulders she stands on. From Ida B. Wells to Rosa Parks to Constance Baker Motley, the first Black woman to argue at the Supreme Court and the first Black woman appointed to the federal judiciary. These heroic Americans and Judge Jackson remind me of this phrase: senators, never limit yourself because of others' limited imagination. Never limit others because of your own limited imagination.
Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, Democrat and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, one of the dozen witnesses today on the final day of the Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearing for nominee for the Supreme Court, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. If you missed any of the 4 days of the hearings, the first day opening statements, days 2 and 3, senators questioning the nominee, and today, day 4, outside witnesses. We covered it all gavel to gavel on the C-SPAN networks. We have it all archived at our website, cspan.org. From the Hill, Senate GOP leader Mitch McConnell said on Thursday he'll oppose Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's Supreme Court nomination. The Hill article goes on that McConnell's decision isn't surprising. He voted against her last year for her appeals court spot and has signaled concerns through the week. But it underscores hardening GOP opposition to Jackson's nomination and comes after McConnell held off on announcing he would vote until after the hearing. McConnell pointed to several reasons for his opposition, including her sentencing decisions, questions about her judicial philosophy, and Jackson's decision not to take a position on expanding the Supreme Court. He also warned that she would engage in judicial activism. That was from the Hill. Here is part of Senator McConnell's floor statement.
President Biden stated he would only appoint a Supreme Court justice with a specific approach that is neither textualist nor originalist. That's the president's litmus test. No strict constructionists need apply. And that president picked Judge Jackson. If the nominee had a paper trail on constitutional issues, perhaps it could reassure us, but she doesn't. When Justice Gorsuch was nominated to the Supreme Court, he'd written more than 200 circuit court opinions that senators could actually study. Justice Kavanaugh had written more than 300. Justice Barrett outpaced them both. She wrote almost 100 appellate opinions in just 3 years, plus years of scholarship as a star professor that senators could actually examine. Judge Jackson has been on the D.C. Circuit for less than a year. He's published only 2 opinions. Beforehand, Judge Jackson served as a trial judge on the district court. She testified on Tuesday that that role did not provide many opportunities to think about constitutional interpretation. Yet when senators tried to dig in on judicial philosophy, the judge deflected and pointed back to the same record she acknowledged would not shed much light. One senator simply asked the judge to summarize well-known differences between the approaches of some current justices. The nominee replied that 2 weeks' notice had not been enough to prepare an answer. President Biden said he would only nominate a judicial activist. Unfortunately, we saw no reason to suspect that he accidentally did the opposite.
Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, the minority leader on the Senate floor today, announcing that he'll be voting no on the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson for the Supreme Court. The Judiciary Committee Chair, Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, says the committee will be voting on the nomination on April 4th. And the Senate Majority Democratic leadership said they're looking to confirm Judge Jackson with a full Senate vote to the Supreme Court by Easter. That's April 17th. After that, the Senate is scheduled at this point to start a 2-week recess. This from CNN. Vice President Kamala Harris unveiled a 21-point plan that seeks to help homeowners impacted by bias in the appraisal process. It was during an event with Housing and Urban Development Secretary Marcia Fudge and Domestic Policy Advisor Susan Rice. The plan developed by a recently formed interagency task force called PAVE, Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity.
Appraisals are meant to be fair and objective estimates of the market value of a property. There's a lot that rides on that estimate, but far too often, for far too many people, They are not fair and objective. Research has repeatedly shown that Black homeowners are more likely to have their homes undervalued than other homeowners. And homes in majority Black and majority Latino neighborhoods are almost twice as likely to be undervalued than homes in other neighborhoods. Because their homes are undervalued, because understand there's a real consequence, Black and Latino people often have to pay more for their mortgage, receive less when they sell the home, and are less able to access home equity lines of credit. Systemic bias in home valuations widens the racial gap, widens the racial wealth gap, and deepens the long-standing financial inequities that divide our communities. And we've heard the stories of people who have tried everything to avoid an unfair appraisal. Stories like that of Tanisha and her family. And these stories are shocking, and they are evidence that systemic change is urgently needed.
Vice President Kamala Harris in the Eisenhower Executive Office building next to the White House. That was from Wednesday. She referred to Tanisha. Joining her, Tanisha Tate Austin, who says that her home in Northern California was originally undervalued by $500,000 by an appraiser because she was African American. And then a few weeks later, she had a second appraisal, and she had a white friend meet the appraiser and put pictures of her white family around the home, and it was valued, she said, at a fair price. Tate Austin suing the original appraiser. Well, today, the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee on Capitol Hill holding a hearing about this issue of home appraisal bias. The witnesses came from that interagency task force that produced this week's report and recommendations for reform. The committee's ranking Republican is Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. He says that the problem is not bias, but that the government is involved too much in mortgages.
Taxpayers stand behind more than two-thirds of our mortgage loans, and federal appraisal regulation extends even to much of the small remaining portion that's not backed by the government. Government intervention begets more government intervention. And here we are today with my colleagues advocating a, quote, action plan that will layer yet more regulation on top of an already Byzantine and antiquated set of appraisal regulations. Thankfully, there are laws against discrimination for real estate transactions, including appraisals. As a result, most institutions have long since abandoned explicit racial discrimination. Even the President's nominee for HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research has publicly acknowledged that. Has the appraisal industry somehow avoided this law? Well, this administration seems to believe that despite the progress we've made to eliminate discrimination in housing, the appraisal industry remains systemically racist. Yesterday, the administration's Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, or PAVE, released a report alleging systemic racial bias in home appraisals. Now, this comes as a bit of a surprise. The report recommends an action plan to address this alleged systemic racism before the government has sufficiently established that a systemic problem exists in the first place. In fact, the report admits that, quote, the exact number of instances of valuation bias is difficult to assess, end quote. And one of the report's recommended actions is to establish metrics to identify appraisal bias. Well, that certainly calls into question whether the authors have enough data to know whether their conclusion is correct.
Senator Pat Toomey, ranking Republican on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, part of his opening statement at today's hearing. Some of the reforms in the Biden administration's action plan include expanding the complaint hotline at the Housing and Urban Development Department and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, making sure the computer systems used to value homes do not perpetuate racial bias, and having appraisal bias training in homeowner education classes. Wall Street today, the Dow up 349, NASDAQ up 269, S&P up 63. Labor Department says the number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits last week fell to its lowest level in 52 years. 187,000 for the week ending March 19th, down 28,000 from the week before, lowest level since September 1969. Unemployment rate stands at about 3.8%. From the New York Post, Mayor Eric Adams exempted the city's athletes and performers from the Big Apple's COVID-19 vaccine mandate on Thursday, following weeks of pressure after it kept Brooklyn Nets star Kyrie Irving from playing in home games and was expected to block some baseball players from taking the field next month. Speaking at Citi Field and joined by executives of both the Mets and Yankees, Adams said Thursday that he had signed the order. That was from the Post. Here's the mayor.
Today I signed Emergency Executive Order 62, expanding the performance exemption to private employer mandates. This is about putting New York City-based performers on a level playing field. Day one, when I was mayor, I looked at the rule that stated hometown players had an unfair disadvantage for those who were coming to visit. And immediately, I felt we needed to look at that. But my medical professionals say, Eric, we're at a different place. We have to wait until we're at a place where we're at a low area and we can re-examine some of the mandates. We're here today. Currently, only non-residents are exempt under this executive order. We expanded it to residents of New York City. It's unimaginable. We were treating our performers differently because they lived and played for home teams. It's not acceptable. This exemption has been put in our sports teams as at a self-imposed competitive disadvantage. But this new order would help boost our economy. Now, before I go on, let's be clear about this. I've said it and I will continue to say, all of us should be vaccinated. Even our players. We will continue to promote vaccinations and booster shots. It's imperative that we do so. That's how we got here. That's why we have an NBA season, because of the vaccination. Over 90% of players did so. And I'm hoping that we will reach the 100% numbers in both Major League Baseball and in basketball and other professional sports. We will continue to push and hope that they do the vaccination and booster shots.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams, a Democrat at Citi Field, where the Major League Baseball Mets play. More from the New York Post article about today's announcement. The city's sweeping vaccine mandates, which led to the firings of more than 1,400 city employees, will still apply to both municipal and private sector workers. During a Q&A session with reporters, Mayor Adams said he didn't plan to rehire any of the fired municipal workers, saying the issue had been litigated in the courts. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get more of Washington's top stories each day sent to your inbox by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word. Go to c-span.org/connect to sign up. Hope you have a good night.